Well, I think to speak about the case against Israel is not controversial in most part of the world. It is only controversial now in the United States and Canada. I mean, Canada used to be a very different place. When I first started visiting Canada in the 1980s, I was telling my host yesterday, and the 1990s was a very different place in which I felt there can be a breathing room for conversations about the Middle East and about Palestine, unlike the United States. But as you know too well, since September 11, if not earlier, Canada has been transformed by the United States government. The public sphere has been confiscated by the US government, not to mention the immigration laws, as well as foreign policy of Canada. Canada has changed dramatically over the years. Canada used to be one of the supporters of the Palestinians in international fora around the world. But since, for the last 10 years, it's a very different story altogether. In the last vote in the United Nations General Assembly about the entry of Palestine into the United Nations, as you know, there was, as usual every year, the world on one side in support of Palestine, the whole world on one side. Usually, every summer, every September, with the new session of the United Nations, there would be Israel, United States, Marshall Islands, and Micronesia. And the last two are really satellites of the United States. This year, on the vote for the entrance of Palestine, there was United States, Canada, Marshall Islands, Micronesia, as well, of course, as Israel, and Canada and the Czech Republic. So it tells you, it's not like Zionism is making headways in international public opinion. Far from it. Palestinian support for Palestine all around the world has been increasing substantially, even in Western Europe, which used to be the bedrock of support for Zionism. It is true what Omar said. I do believe in speaking about Palestine in unequivocal terms, in very clear, explicit, categorical terms. And I think this has to do with personal reasons. When I first came to America in 1983, I was fortunate to be a student in Washington, D.C. And I took the time in the first years when I was there to go to every event, every conference, every speech, even the ones by people I despise. I wanted to learn public speaking about Arab Middle East issues in the United States. And one of the things that troubled me early on was to see how even Arab speakers were intimidated by the audience from expressing views that I knew they held in their head. I used to squirm when I would see Arab speakers squirm whenever they are asked specific questions, simple as whether they recognize Israel or not. And I knew that those people, I knew them personally, did not recognize Israel, and yet they would dance around the issues. I would watch them sweat in trying to produce an acceptable answer to their audience. And I was troubled by that, because I felt there was a measure of hypocrisy. Because I often spoke with those same people afterwards, or before, and I knew what they thought, and I wondered why don't they explicitly state the case as it is, the case against Israel. And when I first started my public speaking in my late years as a graduate student, I faced the same process. I mean, Zionists had a tactic which is quite intimidating if you allow it to intimidate you. When I first started speaking, I would have Zionists in the audience on college campuses in the United States, and they would eagerly wait until the end of my talk, and then somebody would stand up and ask me very bluntly, do you, yes or no, recognize the state of Israel? And I would always answer very simply, of course I wouldn't. Of course I do not recognize the state that was based on the eradication of an already existing nation, that is institutionalized in racist laws, that prospered only through aggression and Western embrace. And that state I do not wish to recognize, especially when that recognition entails a legal acceptance of all the crimes that were inflicted on the Palestinian peoples, the owners of that land. And I noticed after a few talks, experiences like that, Zionists never came to my talks, because they knew it wasn't going to be as intimidating a tactic as it has been. And this is why I always tell my hosts, when they ask me if Zionists are going to show up and stuff, I said, I rarely have that problem. They show up whenever they think they can embarrass or make the speaker awkward. So for me, the case against Israel is not a controversial one. It is a case that is presented around the world and has to be increasingly presented without equivocation or hesitation in fora in Canada and the United States, where there is more Zionist intimidation than other countries, like Europe. I mean, last year I gave a speaking tour on British universities from the south all the way to Scotland, and there was nothing controversial about my message, as it would be here. And I've noticed in the last few years there is something different about Canadian universities. Canadian universities at the administration level really interfere about the selection of speakers. I haven't encountered anything about this campus. I don't know if something happened that I was not informed about. But I noticed in the last few years from Toronto and Montreal and so on, oftentimes student groups have to negotiate with the administration about the selection of speakers that they deem to be controversial to the audience. And oftentimes they veto selection of speakers. So I think you as students should be aware of these threats to free speech and academic freedoms. On the question of Israel, I mean, why the case should be explicitly stated is that because I think there is a deception taking place around the world about how we present the case against Israel. I do not understand how the entire case against Israel can be reduced, as it is by Palestinian leaders today who are puppets of the Israeli occupation, to a question of Israeli settlements on the West Bank. I mean, who says that? I mean, the West Bank settlements began in 1967. As unacceptable as they are, as intrusive on the lives of Palestinians as they are, as illegal as they are under international law, as violently imposed as they are on Palestinian lands, as much as they require the theft of Palestinian national resources, with all that in mind, they started in 1967. So does that mean that before 1967 there was no Palestinian problem? The Palestinian people were all pleased and content in their lives? Absolutely not true. I am speaking about a Palestinian problem that persisted for more than a century and that only survived as an Israeli occupation by virtue of the continuation of the infliction of mass violence on the Palestinian people. Almost, if you follow the Palestinian question in the news, almost not a day goes by without something offensive being perpetrated by Israel. Just today, I read in the New York Times a story, very briefly stated. As many of you know, there were mass protests by Palestinians in the last few weeks because a Palestinian prisoner died in Israeli custody from torture. I mean, even the subservient Palestinian Authority had to admit that according to their health ministry investigation, that young Palestinian man died from torture in Israeli custody. He was bruised all over his body, his bones are crushed, and so on. The Israeli government, as usual, promised an investigation. The Israeli Ministry of Health did produce that investigation. It is an insult to the knowledge that we all have about the history of Israel, and it's an insult to our intelligence. The Israeli Ministry of Health dared pretend that he died from natural causes for reasons that they could not identify. They admit that he died from a sudden heart failure. That they admit. But they claim that all the bruises and the crushed bones and ribs on his bodies were caused by the vigorous effort of resuscitation by the Israeli police. I mean, you have to believe the unbelievable if you want to read the claims of Israeli propaganda. I mean, they want us to believe that his crushed bones, his bruises, and maybe a bullet to the head, all were caused by well-meaning efforts by the Israeli police to resuscitate him. Resuscitate him from what? This is what the report did not indicate. So if you want to believe the lies of that report, this Palestinian man was living his life happily, I guess, in Israeli jail. Suddenly, he lost consciousness and had a heart failure. And in their effort to resuscitate him, they beat the shit out of this man. crushing his bones, his ribs, and his skull. All that to make him alive again. But this is a history, this is the record of Israeli propaganda from long before the state of Israel was established. And for that reason, there is a book in America by a so-called liberal American professor, Alan Dershowitz of Harvard Law School. And he is liberal, although not only he is a supporter of all Israeli massacres and wars and occupations, but he also is a big advocate of torture against Arabs, exclusively against Arabs, I should add. And yet the man has a book called The Case Against Israel. And for me, the case for Israel, he wrote a book, The Case for Israel. And in the acknowledgement of that book, he thanked Natalie Portman for helping him in research while she was a student at Harvard. So she should be added on the boycott list, the BDS list that you have. For me, the case for Israel is a case for ethnic cleansing, massacres, mass violence, occupation, and attacks against a whole number of Arab countries. How could the case against Israel not be undertaken not only by Palestinians, but by all Arabs, and I dare say by all of humanity? It is, the very existence of the State of Israel is a crime against humanity. It is not only that the Palestinians have been victimized by Israel. I'm going to be, in 2 weeks, 53 years old. In my own lifetime, Israel has bombed, attacked the following countries: Tunisia, Sudan, Egypt, Palestine, Lebanon, Jordan, Syria, Iraq. Not to mention attacks by Israel against innocents around the world, and many of their piracy acts around the world, including in 1973 downing a Libyan civilian airliner, killing everybody on board. Or to mention in 1974 when they shot a Moroccan waiter in Norway simply because he resembled a Palestinian leader. He was shot in cold blood near his pregnant wife in a hotel. And the Mossad killers were arrested, but then they were released. As you know, under pressure from the Americans, all Mossad killers are often promptly released to the Israeli government. This is the real record of Israel that you do not hear much about. Because in Canada and in America, they are still insistent, Zionist propagandists, and the government in both countries, to present Israel to us as one that is victim. What is amazing about this line is that Israel would be attacking Syria and Lebanon and Palestine, which it has done in the last few years. In the last year. And yet, the only pictures you see of Israeli violence, you saw the rituals of Israelis posing with their gas masks. This has been a constant picture of propaganda by Israel and by Western media for no known reason. I do not understand why every few months American media and Canadian media have to produce pictures of Israelis posing, and I insist posing, with gas masks, only in order to garner sympathy by completely ill-informed Western audiences, largely in America, I should say, and Canada, who do not know much about the conflict, and in order to draw analogies between the enemies of Israel and between the Nazi killers. This is the effort of Israel. In reality, I want to say, is that the violence to the Arab-Israeli question has been introduced into the region by the Zionist movement, long before even the State of Israel was established. Zionism was founded as a movement that was intent on using violence to achieve its aims. And they were rather blunt about it. Theodor Herzl, the founder of political Zionism, said so when he was asked about the plight of the Arabs in his scheme, which he presented in the Zionist movement first conference in Basel, Switzerland in 1897. When he was asked about the plight of the Arabs, he said, "Qui veut la fin veut les moyens." They did not care about which means they used. They knew that there were Palestinians. It's not that they truly believe that famous, notorious Zionist slogans, "A land without a people for a people without a land." They knew there are people on the land. They knew that those people on the land cultivated every arable acre of land, every cultivable piece of land was cultivated. There was no room for more oranges and more olives. But this goes against the myth that they made the desert bloom. It was blooming already, and it wasn't all a desert. But it was necessary for the Zionist propaganda to present the heroic images that only American Hollywood movies could believe, against all the evidence to the contrary. So in that sense, the Zionist movement began knowing that there will be use of violence in order to subjugate the Palestinian people. I mean, Vladimir Jabotinsky, the founder of revisionist Zionism, and he is the mentor of the current Israeli government of the Likud in Israel, said that between us and the Arabs, we'll establish an iron wall. And now there are walls literally around the state of Israel. There's a wall on the border, the imaginary border that Israel creates for itself, of course, on the borders with West Bank. They're going to create one against Syria. They're going to do one with Egypt now, starting already since the Egyptian uprising and so on. And they believe at all costs, with the support of the United States, they can resist any kind of pressure from around the world and from the people of the region in order to impose the violent Zionist will. From the very beginning, the Palestinians were aware of the dangers of Israel. And they were aware that the Israelis held to a blatantly racist ideology. I mean, there was no qualm about it. This is why the international community, through the United Nations during the Cold War, because the United Nations during the Cold War was freer than it is today, because now it is susceptible to American pressures and so on. In 1974, the international community, the world nations, voted that Zionism is racism. I mean, how Zionism cannot be racism when it preached the colonization of the land. That was their language in the first declaration of Zionism in 1897. The colonization of the land, and they definitely preached the inferiority of the population. Not only they preached it, they sold that to the Europeans. The Europeans were sympathetic to the Zionist colonial project because the Zionists told them, we are going to create an outpost for Europe versus what is the backwardness of Asia that is today embodied in Palestine. I mean, they said that in their own language. They were not ashamed about it in any way. And this is why Zionism is also racist against Jews from Arab and African countries. Because there is no place for that. It was imagined as a Western European colonial project that could be sold to the West, and it worked. The West sympathized with that because they were believers in the virtues of colonialism by Europeans against non-Europeans. That was the plan. The Palestinians from early on became aware of the dangers and mounted resistance against the occupiers. Now there's a whole debate about Palestinian violence and non-violence and so on. I am one to argue, I don't understand the reason why the Palestinians are exclusively required to adhere to strict standards of non-violence in the struggle. I do not understand. All nations of the world celebrate their violent birth, and they mythologize their violent struggle against foreign occupiers. They do that around the world, and they are no shame about it. I mean, the Americans, among others. I mean, the Americans celebrate their violence against the British and their violence against Native Americans, without any qualms. And yet the Palestinians are uniquely asked to adhere to the most impossibly realistic standards of nonviolence, even against Israeli soldiers. And for what reasons? I mean, why do we present the French struggle heroically against Nazi occupation, and it was heroic, without asking questions about the manners of violence that were utilized? I mean, as you all know, French resistance killed a lot of civilians. I mean, when they went after a Nazi collaborator among the French people, when they went to their house, they often killed the man, his wife, the children, and the family dog, oftentimes. Many of the victims were women, even after the liberation of France. In one province of Brittany, 1/3 of all those who were killed by the French resistance after liberation were females. And none of the accounts of the French resistance raises moral questions about why the French resistance did not adhere to the standards of non-violence and why did they hurt this civilians or that civilian. I mean, I am not advocating violence against civilians, but I'm saying there is something political about the standards that are being exclusively imposed on the Palestinian people. They aim not as to steer the struggle in a more moral path, but they want them only to surrender. That was the only thing that is asked by Western government to the Palestinian people. They want them to desist. And I should also remind the audience that the Palestinians, for much of their history, have in fact adhered to standards of non-violent struggle. What did they do in the 1930s and 40s and 50s? Against massive Zionist violence, the Palestinians practiced their own forms of civil disobedience, demonstrations, petitions, women's organizations going to the streets and visiting government offices and so on, and poetry and speeches and all that. That was part of the Palestinian struggle that is not chronicled. Because the West and Western media only want to count acts of violence in order to portray the Palestinian national movement purely in violent terms. Yes, violence has been in the Arab-Israeli conflict, but it was not the Palestinians who introduced indiscriminate mass violence terrorism to the conflict. This is one of the misconceptions that remains alive in the West about Palestinian struggle. Is it the success, the great success of Israel and its supporters in the West of presenting the case of Israel as a victim of terrorism, while I argue Israel is the real pioneer. I mean, if you are a fan of terrorism, you really have to pay tribute. Al-Qaeda and their sister organizations have to pay tribute to the masters of terrorism in the state of Israel. They were the ones who engineered all the most heinous crimes of terrorism that you've seen of September 11 and other places. They were the ones. People say about, Hamas blew up buses and cafes in the 1990s. They did that. They did that. And that, in my opinion, of course, should be avoided by Palestinian strugglers. But this is not the first introduction of these aimless violence to the conflict. They started much, much earlier. Western media do not tell the full story. That bombs in cafes did happen in the 1990s, but they started much earlier. The first instance of bombs in cafes in the Arab-Israeli question was on March 17, 1937, used by Zionists in Jaffa. Hamas did put bombs on buses in the 1990s, but that was not the first time. Bombs were first put on buses between August and September of 1937 by Zionists. And bombs in marketplaces, I know Westerners can name the pizza place in Tel Aviv which was bombed by a Hamas person. But bombs in marketplaces were first used by Zionists in July of 1938 in Haifa. If you want any footnote to anything I say, please email me after the talk. And don't take my word for it. Read Zionist historians who talked about these matters. I mean, Walter Laqueur is a right-wing Zionist historian. In his book, A History of Zionism, you can read about him writing with a bit of pride about how Zionist groups, terrorist bands, used to throw bombs in cafes in Haifa and Jaffa. Bombs in hotels, they were first used by Zionists on July 22nd, 1946 in Jerusalem, the King David Hotel. Oh, I'm sorry, you probably have heard of this one because the victims were white Europeans. Bombings of foreign embassies, they were first used by Zionists in October 1946 in Rome against the British. Mining of ambulances was a common method used by Zionists. First used by them on October 31st, 1946 in Petah Tikva. Letter bombs, first used by Zionists in June 1947 against British targets in the UK. If you've seen the movie Munich, you would know that the Israelis did not stop from using letter bombs against Palestinian civilians, among others, into the 1980s and 90s. They didn't stop. I mean, I am not talking about people who are involved in any violent activities. I'm talking about academics and historians and poets who were killed by letter bombs by Israelis. I mean, I shook the hands of Anis Sayegh, who lost half of his fingers to an Israeli letter bomb in his office in the Palestine Research Center in Beirut, a man never held a gun in his life, refused to train for guns in his life. He was an academic. He's a graduate of the University of Chicago. He was targeted by the Israelis. You've seen the museum in Munich. Wa'il Zaiter, he was the PLO ambassador in Italy. He was a poet and a translator of Arabian Nights into Italian. And he was targeted by the Israelis. I mean, scores. I mean, the entire history of Israel is an anthology of war crimes, massacres, assassinations, and indiscriminate attacks against civilians and refugee camps. I mean, I grew up in Lebanon in the 1960s and 70s. It was without a doubt a weekly affair where Israel would indiscriminately bomb Palestinian refugee camps. I mean, I'm a Lebanese. People often assume that I come from Palestinian mother or father and so on. I mean, I would say I'd be proud to be a Palestinian, but I'm not. I'm Lebanese on both sides of the family. But as many of you know, I am as passionate about it as a Palestinian who grew up in refugee camps, because I could not close my eyes to the suffering of the Palestinians all around me in Lebanon. And I have seen the victims, seen them dead, seen them alive. So I think what's important to bear in mind is that the story of Israel is one that is characterized by distortion of the reality of the conflict. I've often said in America that if Americans become more aware of the facts of the Arab-Israeli question, it's not that they will liberate Palestine for us, no, but they will know the extent to which the public media and the popular culture has deceived the American public and the Western public in general about the background of the Arab-Israeli question. The Palestinians took up arms really in 1960s, the mid-1960s. Prior to that, they relied on false promises of Arabs and Westerners who told them that they would help them liberate their lands if they sat quietly. And quietly they sat for a while. I mean, they protested, but largely non-violently. In the meanwhile, they gave up. By the mid-1960s, they reached the conclusion that we are not going to reach our aim except through armed struggle. And you have to admit, when did we hear the word Palestinian prior to the 1960s? Prior to that, Palestinians were being killed by Israel, and the word Palestinian was not even spoken in public in the West. In 1967, United Nations Security Council Resolution 242, one of the most important resolutions about the conflict ever, and yet the word Palestinian appears not once in that resolution. It merely speaks about a just solution to the a just solution to the refugee problem. Refugee problem. The Palestinians were unnamed. The word Palestine was obscene in Western audiences, and the Palestinians wished to change that. Non-violence, they resorted to it. If you read the historian Benny Morris, who's a very right-wing advocate of ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians, very proud of that, in his book The Righteous Victims, he tells the story that is rarely told, that between 1948 and the 1960s, before there was armed struggle, Fatah or PFLP or any of these groups, during that time, Palestinians strived unarmed to visit their land, to check on their farms, on their homes, to which they still held the keys and the deeds to the land. Many of them wanted to check on their property, and they would go there and they would be shot as pigeons. They would be shot as pigeons upon sight. We don't know the exact number of Palestinians who were killed in that manner, because the Israelis don't count the Palestinian victims. For them, they are a bulk. In the book Righteous Victims, Benny Morris says that it is in the thousands Palestinians unarmed were shot like pigeons by Israelis in those years, because they wanted to check on their land. So in the mid-1960s, and the Palestinians have nothing to apologize about. They took up arms against a violent, brutal occupation. And this was before the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza. For those who want to deceive us to believing that the Palestinian question can be reduced into 22% of all of Palestine. The Palestinians know the story full well. Most Palestinian refugees, 5 million of them, are not from the West Bank and Gaza. They are from areas that are now part of the state of Israel. I have a friend of mine who grew up in a refugee camp in Ain al-Halwi in South Lebanon. And he is from a little village in northern Palestine, Al-Bassa. He visited, after he got his American passport, he went to the West Bank and he went to Jerusalem. He told me it didn't mean much to me. I relate to the Galilee, to northern Palestine. That's where he's from. And there's no way you can convince him to relocate in order to allow Israel to enjoy the occupation of lands prior to 1967. So the Palestinians took up arms, and as soon as they did that, the world paid attention to their cause. It is absolutely not true that armed struggle did not pay for the Palestinians. The fact that there are Palestinian embassies all around the world, more embassies for Palestine than for Israel, is a testimony to the effectiveness of the Palestinian path of armed struggle since the mid-1960s. Because before that, the Palestinians were not even addressed. People thought that they could negotiate an end to the Palestinian problem by negotiating with the British, the puppet of British imperialism, and now of American imperialism in Jordan. You remember that? People of my age and older, you remember that King Hussein, one of the most hated men by Palestinians, was asked to negotiate on behalf of the Palestinians. And of course, those efforts ended, because now people know the Palestinians would not accept a regime that is aligned with Israel to negotiate on their behalf. Sadly, there is now a puppet collaborationist regime in the West Bank, in Ramallah, that now is expected to negotiate on behalf of the Palestinians. Of course, it serves the pleasure of Israel. So I think the record of terrorism tells the story. The Palestinians took up arms rather late, and there's a whole debate among Palestinians about the best forms. Not as armed struggle being the only method to liberate Palestine, but it is one of many methods that the Palestinians have pursued and will pursue. The notion that Palestinians have to put up arms and negotiate with Israel on parts of 22% of what is left of Palestine is not going to persuade any Palestinians. This will not fly with the Palestinian people. And as a result, the efforts of propping up a collaborationist regime in West Bank is not going to succeed. I mean, another reason why the case against Israel has to be presented is that it was founded as a proudly racist state. The state of Israel was founded as a proudly racist state. It was founded on the principle of one people being inferior, another people being superior. The claims to the land by the inferior people have to be disregarded, and the claims to the land by the superior people will be respected by the international Western audience. That's how it was. In fact, Lord Balfour, of the famous Balfour Declaration of 1917, which promised a land that Britain did not own to a people who did not own Palestine. It promised Palestine to the Zionist movement in 1917, November 2nd. When Lord Balfour, who himself was an anti-Semite, just like many Zionists in the West are anti-Semite, Lord Balfour was asked later about how he could justify promising a land Britain did not own to a people who had no claim to the land. And he famously said, numerical self-determination was excluded by us. Think about that phrase. Numerical self-determination was excluded. This is basically a rephrasing of apartheid philosophy. I mean, it's not about numeric, it's not about quantity, it's about quality. He said the quality of the Jews is superior to the Arabs who own the land. I mean, you know that the Zionists in 1948 did not own not even 10% of the land. The land was stolen. The land was stolen and given as a trust exclusive, racistly exclusive to the Jewish people, not to be dispensed with except to the benefit of the Jewish people, as you know that. I mean, the state of Israel made sure that the land will never go back to its own original owners, even though they hold the keys to the house and the deeds to the land. The state of Israel was founded along racist lines, racist laws, not in terms of the property of the land, but even in terms of citizenship. You probably all know this. If you are a Jewish person from Vancouver, you can go to Israel and will obtain automatic citizenship in that state. If you are a Palestinian like Omar, who is a descendant of people who have been in that land for centuries, who grew up in a refugee camp, if he were to try to enter and visit a land that his grandfather owned, he would be shot on sight like a pigeon. These are the racist laws of the state of Israel. You probably know this. Between 1948 and 1966, the whole Palestinian people, only the ones who were allowed to stay behind, were put under military rule. The state of Israel always had separate set of rules and laws. Some that applies to the Palestinians and some that apply to the Jews. Look at the West Bank. The water use of the West Bank is 15-1 in favor of the Jewish settlers. 15-1. The Palestinians don't have enough water to drink. And as you know, if you've seen pictures of Israeli settlements, they have large swimming pools. I mean, the Palestinians know that. That's racism. I mean, that is blatant racism. As well as the fact that when the Palestinians inside the state of Israel were put under military rule, they were not allowed to move. Look at the picture of Mahmoud Darwish, the foremost Arab poet, just outside of this room. This guy, Mahmoud Darwish, grew up inside Israel. Do you know that he spent so much of his time in jail for writing poetry? I mean, this is a state that prosecutes people for writing poetry that deems offensive to the brutality of the state of Israel. This is the real record of Israel. Not to mention the fact that Israel could only live throughout the years and decades by virtue of a twin combination of Western financial and military support and a continuation of wars, aggression, occupations, and attacks throughout. I mean, the Israelis are quite blunt about their military doctrine to keep the Arabs intimidated. Unfortunately for Israel, and fortunately for the Palestinians, increasingly the Arabs are much less intimidated. The last war between Israel and Lebanon in 2006 is a good example. This was a war in which a band of volunteers, of course they call them Hezbollah here to stigmatize them. I mean, they are Hezbollah, most of them, but not all of them. But they are people of the South Lebanon land. These are the people of South Lebanon. That's where I come from. It's not that Hezbollah comes from outside or Hamas came from Mars. These are the people of the land who sometimes join different political movements. In the 1970s, most Palestinians were members of secular groups. Now they are not. That should not delegitimize their cause. That should not disqualify them from fighting occupation. Even if I do not support the ideologies that most Palestinians today support. But that's what the Israelis do. They always want to discredit the Palestinians by associating with whoever is the enemy of the United States. Back in the 1960s and 70s, when I came to America in the 1980s, the Zionists in America were saying the Palestinians are all agents of the KGB and of the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union collapsed, now they say they are all agents of Iran and Syria and Hezbollah. I mean, they happen to choose who happens to be the enemy of the United States, and they put the Palestinians in that camp to discredit them. I mean, it's too stupid to be believed. But if you live in America, it is widely believed. It is widely believed. Israel wants to present that case in order to discredit any effort of resistance by the Palestinians. I mean, the question that has to be asked is, what are the Palestinians expected to do? I mean, the Americans blatantly say that they are on the side of Israel and they will support all Israeli wars. And the Arabs, clearly, not the government, are saying they are not going to give in and they're not going to give up. They will continue, Lebanese and Palestinians and others, to fight against Israeli occupation and aggression. Israel still occupies lands in Lebanon, still occupies the Golan Heights in Syria, still occupies land in Jordan. And of course, the puppet regime in Jordan does not dare speak about how unfair the peace treaty between Jordan and Israel was to the Jordan itself. But, I mean, this is the Royal Hashemite family of Jordan that you know quite a bit about its history. So Israel's record of occupation aggression is not only against Palestine. This is why there is such large-scale global hostility to Israel. I mean, if you go to Norway and Sweden and Denmark, largely a week goes by where there is no demonstration against Israel. International public opinion has switched markedly in favor of the Palestinians. Asia, Africa, Western Europe, Latin America, all changed, shifted. Even in Germany, used to be, after the Second World War, for obvious reasons, the most pro-Israeli government there is. Even in Germany, now there is more support for Palestinians over the Israelis. Of course, in America, it has remained unchanged since the Second World War. Something like 60-65% of all Americans, when asked, they choose the Israeli side over the Palestinians. The Palestinians get the support of 10-14%. Maybe the only ones who have really actually read about the background of the Arab-Israeli conflict. Now, it seems to me, I am not one to say that we need Western support and we need the peace process in order to help the Palestinians and to end the conflict. No. I, for one, do not advocate peace. I mean, don't get me wrong. I am for peace, but after the state of Israel, not during the state of Israel. Real peace can only come after the elimination of Zionist institutions from Palestine. Real peace will come when the Palestinian refugees are returned to their homes, not only in the West Bank and Gaza, but to what is today Israel. I believe that real peace will come when there is a new state that is not Jewish or Islamic or Christian, that is secular, which basically recognizes the Palestinian right to self-determination and full return to their lands and their compensation. I am not for the peace they talk about today. They do not want peace, those who speak in Canadian government or American about the peace process. That peace process has been in place since 1970s. In that time, Israel added more land, more wars, more massacres, and more war crimes. The peace process is an act of deceit intended to prolong the suffering of the Palestinians and to give a cover for Israel to perpetrate its crime against the Arabs. For that reason, I call for an end to the peace process. The Palestinians and Arabs should not be part of it. This is a deceptive scheme against the interests of the Palestinian people. I am for real peace, which would be based on real justice. And I think that the arguments by the United States and by the Canadian government and by all Western supporters of Zionism is flawed. It assumes that with the passage of time, the military will of Israel is capable of subjugating the Palestinians. It hasn't worked for a century. It is not likely to work for another century. And for that reason, I think Omar spoke about my visit to the refugee camp in Nahr al-Bared, which, as he said, was destroyed by the Lebanese army to the cheers of Western governments and Arab governments, I should say. And he's right. I went there with tremendous trepidation, with built-in sadness and resentment. And instead of going there, letting loose to my tears, I was cheered by my audience, by the people of the camps who moved to another camp. They are double refugees twice. Instead of me trying to console them, they were more consoling me. They took me to a picture exhibit that they had, in which pictures of the old camp and of old Palestine were shown. Their will was as strong as I have known it since I started visiting Palestinian refugee camps in my youth. And I think the Palestinians also are fully aware of history. I mean, the Crusaders stayed in the Holy Land for 2 centuries. But the people of the region were absolutely certain that they will not stay in their midst forever. And this, I think, is one of the reasons, plus optimism of the will, why the Palestinians and the Arabs are optimistic about the future, that the Zionist project cannot be sustained for too long. It doesn't belong into the century we live in, and for that reason, I invite people to become more outspoken in their explicit denunciation, not of Israeli action, but of the very existence of the violent state of Israel. Thank you for listening.